sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
He's out of control. I'm talking about Glenn.
I know. Rental farm.
Somehow you didn't need to clear that up.
What's wrong with you people?
You didn't think it would turn on you, did you?
What's wrong with you people?
So the one I'm not going to tell, the one I decided not to tell is, you know the difference between boogers and broccoli?
I get the feeling I'm getting ready to find out.
Kids won't eat broccoli.
Yeah, good thing you didn't tell that one. It wasn't funny at all.
You should, yeah.
So what's the better one? Did you have a better one picked out, or?
Well, it's too, well, this is more about, you know, life. I'm thinking about life and how we approach our days and everything. And days can, you know, life has its up. You got me thinking about this last week. You said, let's talk about depression, which we're not going to, but. So two beavers were sitting there by the creek and by the river, and one of them looks at the other and goes, Bob, you know, you just haven't looked like yourself lately. He goes, yeah, I've been kind of depressed. He goes, well, what's wrong? He says, you know, it's just life. It's one damn project after another.
All right.
Oh, that was cute.
I've got more.
No, that was better than the booger one. Stop there. Stop there.
So the Love Your Life workshop, welcome. Once again, we've got another week. I was thinking this week about a lot of things, but you know, we talk about love a lot, and that's, you know, one of the I guess motivations and inspirations for the Love Your Life workshop is two things. One is simplicity, the desire for simplicity, putting things in their simplest terms, you know. And so I've always loved the story that we come back to about Jesus and the guy saying, what's the greatest commandment, you know. And I could just picture, you know, saying that, you know, like, you know, I've got all this, I've been taught all this stuff, I got all this Bible stuff, I got people, preachers preaching and people telling you what to do, just simplify it, you know. So they come up with, and Jesus asks him, you know, and the answer is love God, and then he adds to that, love your neighbor as yourself. So I was thinking about that, and the thought occurred to me this week, you know, is so much going on in our world, you know, and you know, my friend Brian, when he moved to New York when I was in college, and he had just graduated, and so, you know, we'd grown up in the safe suburbs of Newark, and he moved to New York City, and something had happened in New York at that time, and he said, you know, crazy thing about living in New York is like, you know, you think you could die in some crazy way any day. Some crazy thing could happen. There's so many people, somebody just loses control of their car, they can end up killing a bunch of people, you know. And now the world's become that place. The world has really become that place. And so the other day I was just thinking, you know, if I were to die, what would I regret? Because it was a day when I was just thinking about all these things I got to do, and then I suddenly stopped and thought, would I really have that much regret if I didn't accomplish these things? And so the thought occurred to me, well, you know, what I would regret would be the love I hadn't given. And then I started thinking about that, thinking, well, what does that mean, you know, in terms of practicality, and in terms of, it's real easy to say, well, I believe in love, you know, love should be what the world's about, but what does that mean? So, and what I thought about that for a while, what I came down to is what that really means is, what does that mean in terms of how I spend my day? And we all have our days that we spend, which are just kind of one moment after another, and can become monotonous moments. We just go through our days. And what does it mean to get up and say, well, I believe in love? You know, how many people don't? I mean, there are people who don't, but so I think it's interesting that Jesus tagged on that love God, you know, this kind of mysterious, non-tangible thing with oh, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now it becomes very concrete. And so I thought, well, really what it means is it comes down to how much, the value I place on a person, on people. And that's what it really comes down to. So I was reminded of another story, and so I want to just hit on this story and see if it prompts any thought. I think it's a pretty amazing story, and in the Bible it's in the Gospel of John, chapter 9. And I've touched on it quite often over the last several years. But it really, if you just get to where that story took place, if you kind of could walk along with it, it's an amazing story, which I think really brings out to me the different ways that we look at people. And sometimes starting out with the right intention of wanting to be good, wanting to be right, wanting to have a good philosophy, wanting to live with love. And yet what happens, So, here's Jesus and his disciples. He's the rabbi, and here's his disciples, who probably would have said, oh yeah, we're all about love and loving God and all that. So they come across a blind beggar. And the first thing they do, and there's like 4 or 5 different views of a person in this story that hit home. And the first thing they do is they make a problem out of the guy. So they see a blind beggar, and maybe anticipating that Jesus might want to do something, and I'm guessing they probably got tired of hanging around all the poor, diseased, crippled people. That's probably not what they signed on for when they decided to follow Jesus. They probably thought they were going to be around a little bit more, cooler people. So they see a blind beggar, and instantly they say to Jesus, was it his parents do something wrong, or did he do something wrong to cause this condition? And so that, as a prevailing view of the day, it's not necessarily so much different than today. It's very easy for me to look at somebody's situation and say, well, what did they do wrong? Certainly they must have made bad judgments here. Or their parents, they've inherited this is a generational thing. And there can be those factors. But it's just the whole idea of that sometimes I look at people and immediately I see the problem. I see a problem. What's their problem? And so the disciples did that. And so one thing that is for sure is that if that is my view of people, then I'm looking at the problem, which also tends to lead to gossip, or is a part of gossip. I never have to really deal with them. I keep this barrier up. So that was the disciples. And we'll get to Jesus in a minute. So, Jesus kind of answers them, and he goes, no, it has nothing to do with it. And he kind of says something that I guess I'll put in my own words was like, well, this man exists so that God's work can be, God's glory or God's work or love, however you want to put it, can be seen in his life. Then he heals the guy. Now, kind of put that out, because it's real easy to say, well, wow, whether you believe in miracles or not, it's real easy to say, well, that was easy for him. Too bad we can't all work miracles. But kind of put that aside, because what's interesting is he healed this guy and sent him on his way, and the guy didn't even know who did it. Which is kind of backwards in the way that very often religious people tend to go about these things. I remember when I was part of a church, and we would do big baskets for people at Christmas. And I'm not knocking this, but what we did is we made sure they knew who did this. Here's our card, here's where we go to, and the intentions were good, but I'm just saying, here's what Jesus did, is he, instead of saying, I'm Jesus, I want you to know who did this, he just said, look, the point of this guy's life is not that he's a problem. The point is that, is God loves him, and he heals a guy and sends him on his way, doesn't even tell him who did it. So that's the story. So the problem is Jesus did it on the Sabbath. So as you know, that creates a problem. So he goes and religious leaders who believe in religion, they are religious, and who knows, maybe started out at some point with, surely they had read all the scriptures about love when Moses said, here's, love the Lord your God and all that. But somehow their religion overrode people, came before people. I mean, that's not surprising. We see that in an extreme way right now, but all religions are guilty of this, where the religion becomes greater than people. So they began to question this guy because he was healed on the Sabbath, and which is comical. Well, the neighbors began to see this guy, and they're like, "Wait, weren't you the guy that used to beg?" They don't even know his name. Weren't you the blind beggar? And this I find amazing because you would think, I think it said he'd been since birth, and yet they didn't know his name. And I think that's probably pretty typical. It's probably pretty typical. So they had a label for the guy, and that's another thing that we're probably all prone to do at times, just label someone. And I heard somebody say once, all labels are libel, and so they just he was a blind beggar that didn't even know his name. And of course he looked different because he wasn't blind anymore, he wasn't begging. And aren't you this guy? So he had the disciples who saw him as a problem, the neighbors who saw him as just a label, then the religious people who began to question him, and he upset their balance and upset their religious tradition. And the interesting thing, he doesn't know who did it. He didn't know who did it. And so they just keep questioning this guy. They bring his parents in. And his parents, they don't stand up for him. They see him as totally, it's just a biological. Yes, he's our son, we're his parents, but we have nothing to do with this. So that relationship really didn't go anything more than biological. And so that's kind of where the story is. And then it's actually, if you read the story, it becomes kind of comical because he begins to, the religious leaders question him to the point where and they're obviously angry, where he says, "Oh, you must want to be, whoever this guy is, you must want to be his followers too. You're trying so hard to figure out who he is." And of course they get really angry and they kick him out of the synagogue, which is more than sending him out, but they really are banishing him from all that they do there in their community. And at this point Jesus comes back and he finds him. And so and even when he finds him, he kind of says, "How are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm looking for the guy who healed me." And Jesus basically says, "Well, he's standing in front of you." He can't even say, "I did it, it's me." In a very humble way, he goes, "Well, the guy I did is standing right here." And so he falls down. And so I don't think that he just fell down at Jesus simply because, "Wow, you healed me." That was a big deal. He lived with that his whole life. And but think about the way he had been treated by all these people. And that day wasn't the first day. And so here's somebody who did something incredibly good for them and walked away and took no credit, just gave it to him. And yet also kept his ear to the pulse of what was going on so that Jesus knew and heard that he had been kicked out of the synagogue and went and found him. And so I just look at that as like, Jesus could talk about, love God is the most important thing, and you might picture him as just getting away, and yet what that meant was in this situation, this very practical example that the person is more important than all these other things. And I think about how a lot of my life, my philosophy, very often overrides my treatment of people. It's very easy for that to happen. Or a million other things. My schedule. What I think of as right and wrong and somebody else doing what I think is wrong can override my treatment and care of people. And yet that can be, if I keep that in my mind enough, that can be a great guide as I just go through my day in little situations after little situations. Was wait, the person's more important here than whatever. Anyway, so I thought I'd throw that out. That's what I've been thinking about. See if that sparks anything. Or maybe you're thinking about, or as Glenn said the other night, how does that make you feel?